So today, Jeanne Abrams, I will introduce our guest, received her PhD in American history with a specialization in archival management from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and has been a member of the faculty of the University of Denver since 1983 in the Center for Judaic Studies and University Libraries. In 2006, she was promoted to full professor. She has also served as the longtime director of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and curator of the Beck Archives of Rocky Mountain Jewish History, part of the Center for Jewish Studies and Special Collections at the University of Denver Libraries. And she is well known locally as well nationally for her expertise in medical and early American history and the Jewish history of American West. Dr. Abrams is also the author of 6 books, including her newest, A View from Abroad, the story of John and Abigail Adams in Europe, which we have had the privilege of hearing about. So please welcome Dr. Jeanne Abrams.
Afternoon, it's nice to be with you. The title said, of course, that Jews have had kind of an ambivalent relationship with American presidents over the years. I'm going to start with a little story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, but I'm really going to be talking about the early presidents. But I would say perhaps FDR was the most admired president in the Jewish community during his administrations. The vast majority of Jews in the United States voted for Roosevelt. And the common joke going around at the time was that Jews were interconnected with 3 worlds. And I have to explain, first of all, that the Yiddish word for world is Welt. So people used to say 3 worlds, dieser Welt, this world, jener Welt, the world to come, and Roosevelt. So it was just a kind of a reflection. He certainly had Jews in the cabinet. Generations after, historians and Jews question whether FDR could and should have done more to save Jews during the Holocaust, but that might be another time and another talk, because we're going to examine America's early presidents. And just to give you some context, let me point out that during the colonial, revolutionary, and early national periods in America, Jews in America numbered only about 2,500. That's across the entire 13 colonies. So most Americans, even presidents, actually knew very few Jews. So let's start with George Washington, the father of the country and our first president. In the summer of 1790, George Washington and several government officials left New York City, which was then the temporary United States capital, and took kind of a goodwill trip of sorts to Rhode Island, the last state to ratify the Constitution. And while he was in Newport, he was inspired to issue a major statement on religious freedom, inspired in turn by the letter that he received from Moses Seixas, who was the leader of the Newport Turo synagogue. Seixas wasn't the rabbi, he was the chazan, the chazan then. First, we also have to realize that Jews in Rhode Island enjoyed many rights that Jews in other colonies did not have. Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams, who actually went to that area to establish religious freedom. He felt constrained in Massachusetts. And so Rhode Island had no established church. Jews there in Rhode Island were free to worship as they pleased and build synagogues. So ignore my cell phone in the background. I don't want to get up to turn it off. I thought I had put it on vibrate. And that was not true in all the other colonies. For example, in New York City, what was then New Amsterdam, we know today is New York City, the governor of the colony, Peter Stuyvesant, maintained that Jews had to worship only privately in houses. I'm going to turn this off, okay, so that whoever's trying to badly get me, I don't think it's very important. So that Jews had to serve in private houses. And New York had a very fraught relationship with early Jews who first came there in the 1600s. And Peter Stuyvesant, as I said, who was the governor, did not want Jews to settle in New Amsterdam. And he had really a group of Jews had come from Recife, Portugal, escaping really the long arm of the Spanish Inquisition. And they were supposed to go to Cuba. Something didn't work out, and they ended up really literally being dropped off in New Amsterdam. He wanted to expel them, but the Dutch East India Colony, which ran New York at the time, had a number of Jews on the board of trustees, and they advocated for their fellow Jews here in America. And so reluctantly, but by their decree, he allowed Jews to settle there, but they had to guarantee they would care for their own, and they were not allowed to build a synagogue for decades afterwards. But Seixas sent a very welcoming letter to Washington, and Washington in turn in August of 1790 issued a very famous letter, and I'm going to read it to you because I think it's worth examining. And if we were all in person, I would have distributed copies. We would have taken turns. But this letter is really considered the foundation of religious tolerance and freedom in the United States, and that's why really people of all faiths point to this letter. It is a classical outlook on American views on religious freedom, which was tied to the Bill of Rights. And this letter that I'm going to read to you has become famous and has even been cited in Supreme Court cases. So let me read it to you. Gentlemen, while I received with much satisfaction your address replete with expressions of esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced on my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. And the salient part, I won't read every section because of course he's talking about how wonderful it is now to be early Americans and be part of the United States. And he says, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worth of imitation. And here is what he says. All possess, this is the key part, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were an indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights, for happily the government of the United States, which gives bigotry to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, and giving it on all occasions their effectual support. So of course, what he's saying here is, doesn't matter if you're Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, all that we ask is that you comport yourself as good citizens, and that guarantees you the right to practice religion as you please. It would be, keep going on, it would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. And then he ends, may the children of the stock of Abraham, and by that the stock of Abraham are Jews, who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So he's quoting from the Bible about the vine and fig tree. And then he ends, may the Father of all mercies, and for that he's referring to God, scatter light and not darkness upon our paths, and make us all in our several vocations usefully here, and in his own due time and way, everlasting happy. So this is really kind of a watershed document in American history. You know, of course, that Jews were certainly not as well tolerated. And of course, we've experienced periods of anti-Semitism throughout American Jewish history. And sadly, we still continue to experience that. But it is part and parcel of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the custom of the country, really first vocally expressed by President Washington, that assures us that Jews are equal citizens under the law. That wasn't perfect. We're going to know that they couldn't hold office in early years, etc. But it was far ahead of all the rest of the countries. And Washington, I don't know if I would call him religiously observant, but he was certainly believed in God. And he really, in his farewell address, he maintained that morality and is necessary for a strong republic. And he also maintained that morality cannot be maintained without religion. So he actually supported a number of different religions. He, of course, adhered to Christianity, but we'll see that he was very similar to many of the presidents who followed. Jeanne Abrams went to Harvard. We talked about him last time, our second president. He was probably, at least in his early years, more closely tied to religion, but it played a very important part in his life throughout. I don't know that most people know that Abrams went to Harvard, and Harvard required a thorough knowledge of Hebrew, so he could read and translate Hebrew well, and a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament. And for him too, he's talked many, many times. He felt that religion was integral to the success of a democracy and the foundation of a stable republic. And again, they both considered that tied, of course, to morality and civic responsibility. Although Abrams could make some negative stereotypical remarks about Jews, I have a couple of letters where he was angry at one of his relatives and he called him a Shylock. Talking about the stereotype of the, I think, kind of actually a sympathetic character in The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, and he and Abigail were very familiar with Shakespeare. But Abrams reiterated many times that he admired Jews for bringing monotheism and civilization to the world. And this is a direct quote from one of his letters where he says, "I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation." He also said in a criticism of the French philosopher Voltaire and his negative depiction of Jews, that Abrams said instead, "They, the Jews, are the most glorious nation that have ever inhabited this earth." In the end, Abrams became more of a Unitarian, and his guiding principle in life was to do all the good he could. But again, he firmly believed in the advocacy of freedom of thought and belief, and thought contemporary Jews were worthy of respect, and that they and everyone else in the United States deserved equal rights and protection under the law. I mean, we talked about this last time. Abrams did not think everyone was created equal, but he felt that everyone should have equal opportunity, and that everyone had the liberty to pursue their religion as they wished. And most importantly, perhaps, that everyone deserved equal protection under the law. So then we come to Jefferson, who's criticized often as kind of irreligious and a deist on some level. And he did make some negative remarks about the Old Testament and found Jews, at least in the Old Testament, to be superstitious. But he did believe in religious freedom. And I don't know if how many people are familiar with this, but Jefferson made his own Bible by cutting up different parts of various printed Bibles, and he took out anything that he thought was supernatural. So his Bible was his own annotated, edited version of the Bible, leaving in stories, leaving in moral lessons, I guess I would say, but taking out anything that he would consider supernatural. But I think it's very telling that Jefferson actually dictated what was to be written on his gravestone. And this is what he said: "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, 1779, and father of the University of Virginia." And of course, Jefferson did many, many things and served as president and was ambassador in Europe. But what was most important to him was the Declaration of Independence. And then secondly, the religious freedom, the first colony that actually passed a statute for religious freedom that he was integral in getting passed. And then, of course, he believed very firmly in education. And so he really was the founder of the University of University of Virginia. And it's also interesting to note that Jefferson was one of the few voices in the early republic that championed political rights for Jews. He wrote a Jewish doctor in Charleston that he hoped, and I'm quoting him exactly now, he hoped Jews will be seen taking their seats of the branches of science as preparatory to their doing the same at the board of government. And Jefferson may not have admired Judaism, but he believed Jews and all minorities should have equal rights with all American citizens. And you noticed he had a friend who was a doctor. Remember, I told you there were not many Jews in America in the United States in the early years. Most of them were either merchants, shopkeepers, and sometimes traders. And some of them were doctors. So it's interesting that Jefferson had a relationship with a Jewish doctor. Dolly Madison had a Jewish doctor that treated her. And we will see, along the way, Abigail Adams. So many of them actually did cross paths with Jewish physicians. Then the next president, James Madison, was largely responsible, as we know, for the composition of the Bill of Rights. And also most people, this is a surprise to them as well, that Madison went to Princeton, where he majored in Hebrew and the Old Testament. So we've got a lot of early presidents walking around who are very familiar with the Jewish Bible and probably can read Hebrew better than many people today. And Madison wrote a letter similar to Washington's early letter that we read to the Jews of Savannah. And he referred to the fact that in the United States, quote, perfect equality of rights to every religious sect. And he commented that the Jews of Savannah were good and faithful citizens, and he was happy that a people who had been oppressed elsewhere in the United States were loyal citizens that deserved equal rights with all citizens. Now, Benjamin Franklin's not an early president, but he's such a prominent early figure in American history that I wanted to bring him in a little bit as well. Again, he was accused of being a deist. I don't think that was exactly right. He certainly believed in God, and he said toward the end of his life, I'm quoting him, "Here is my creed. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshiped, that the most acceptable service we render him is doing good to him and to his children. So for Franklin, and actually for most of the presidents, the public good was the way they expressed their religion in many ways. As a matter of fact, I recall when Benjamin Franklin's mother criticized him because he gave up, he retired from business in his early 40s. He was well off, and the rest of his life he devoted to public service on one level or another. He was in Europe as an ambassador for many years. Many projects in the United States bore his imprint. And he wrote to her and said that he would prefer on his gravestone that it said that he didn't spend his life making money, but he spent his life doing good. And he did in many ways. It occurs to me, this is another story too, of the presidents and early Americans and illness and health. But he was able to provide free smallpox inoculations that he basically raised money for, underwrote in Philadelphia for poor children. And he really helped make that available publicly, and he really started what would have been the first voluntary hospital in the United States. And he also was famous for the fact that he contributed to any religious group erecting a house of worship. So he gave the first monetary contribution to Mikveh Israel, the first Jewish synagogue in Philadelphia. So again, not a president, but just very interesting. Next, I'm going to talk about General Ulysses Grant, who ultimately became president as well, who eventually had, I would say, a pretty good relationship with the Jewish community, but it did not start out well. During 1862, during the Civil War, General Grant authorized the most blatant official episode of anti-Semitism in 19th century history. In December of 1862, he issued his infamous Order Number 11, which expelled all Jews from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And I'll give you a little background of why that happened. There had been a huge black market in Southern cotton during the war. Northern textile mills needed Southern cotton, and the Army needed it to make uniforms and tents. So President Lincoln allowed limited trading in Southern cotton, but it had to be controlled by the United States Treasury Department, and the Army had, only the Army had the, was allowed to license that. But unlicensed traders often bribed Union officers to allow them to buy cotton without a permit. Grant, who was busy with the war, he was trying to defend and capture Vicksburg at the time, was incensed because he was also made to be in charge of issuing licenses in his area. And he was very angry over the corruption that was going on. When Grant's own father came before him to seek a license for a group of Cincinnati merchants, some of them who were Jewish, he became extremely angry. There was a lot of corruption during the Civil War in terms of business, but just a handful of corrupt traders were Jews, and the vast majority were not. They were honest businessmen. But it really, I guess, inflamed a resurgence of anti-Semitism. General Grant became convinced that the black market in cotton was organized by Jews, and the order read, quote, "No Jews allowed to trade on the railroad southward or to be granted trade licenses." When illegal trading continued, on December 17th, Grant issued Order Number 11, and this quotes it, a direct quote from the order. "The Jews as a class violating every regulation established by the Treasury Departments are hereby expelled from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi within 24 hours. Some Jewish traders had to walk 40 miles to evacuate. In Paducah, Kentucky, military officials gave the town's 30 Jewish families, all of them long-term residents, none of them speculators, and at least 2 of them were Union Army veterans, only 24 hours to leave the region. Paducah's Jewish leaders, led by Caesar Caskill, sent a telegram to President Lincoln condemning Grant's order as a violation of their constitutional rights as good citizens. And there were protests in St. Louis, Louisville, and Cincinnati, and many telegrams sent to the White House from Jewish communities including Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. Caskill himself arrived in Washington, D.C. on January 3rd, 1863, 2 days after the Emancipation Proclamation. He went to the White House, and Lincoln actually received them promptly. He allowed them to come in. He studied the order and almost immediately commanded Grant to revoke the order. Grant complied 3 days later. Lincoln was taking a risk because he couldn't afford to alienate his top general, but because he felt it was unjust, Lincoln really relied on his conscience, and he overturned the order. On January 6th, Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the leader of the reform movement in America, led a delegation to visit President Lincoln to express his gratitude. And Lincoln expressed his surprise that Grant had issued the order and stated his conviction that, quoting Lincoln exactly, to condemn a class is to say the last, excuse me, let me reread that. To condemn a class is, to say the least, to wrong the good with the bad. Lincoln said he drew no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and he would allow no American to be wronged because of his religious affiliation. So here's another major step forward, I would say, for religious freedom for Jews. After the war, Grant seemed to reverse his position, and he said that the order had been prepared by a subordinate, that he was so busy, he signed it without actually reading it. Don't know if that's true or not, but eventually Grant carried the Jewish vote in the presidential election of 1868, and he even named several Jews to high office in his cabinet, which was very unusual at the time. So I assume that was his form of apology. I'm going to end with President Lincoln because I think few people realize what a crucial role Lincoln had in making the Jews equal in America. Unlike many others of his time, he viewed Jews as equals, and he befriended many of them personally. And it actually starts with his parents, who were both Protestants, but they belonged to a sect that opposed conversion of Jews. They felt that it was God's purview only, not people, who could dictate people's religions, and that everyone, again, had the freedom to choose as they wish. So he already grew up in, I would say, a rather tolerant background for the time. And when Lincoln moved to Springfield, Illinois, he had Jewish neighbors, clients, and political allies that were central to his success, and we'll talk about a few of them. The main Jewish friend that Lincoln developed was Abraham Jonas, a Jewish lawyer and a lifelong close friend who really helped make Lincoln's political career happen. He worked to secure Lincoln's nomination for the Republican Party. And later, also Lincoln's podiatrist, the Jewish podiatrist Issachar Zachariah, and he was Sephardic, and most of these Jews, not all, but most of them were at the time. His podiatrist actually helped turn out the Jewish vote for Lincoln's second election. Once in the White House, Lincoln displayed his empathy and tolerance for Jews on several occasions. first, of course, classically, reversing so quickly Grant's order. Also, though, Congress had established that military chaplains had to be Christians during the Civil War. So Jews actually were second-class citizens in that respect in the Army. And Lincoln actually arranged for a compromise, one that allowed Jews to minister to their co-religionists in the Army. So they were, of course, not chaplains to non-Jewish or Gentile Army members, but they were allowed to minister to their Jewish co-religionists. And we actually, most people don't realize we're coming up to Passover very soon, that even Jewish soldiers, many of them were very intent on celebrating Passover. I don't have it with me, but I've used it before in classes. One of the soldiers rode home and told about how they had conducted a Passover Seder, how they had gotten bitter herbs along the road. They found some herbs that were past to their sell date that they used. They were able to bake their own matzahs, getting some flour from the quartermaster, et cetera, et cetera. So there certainly were Jews who were active on the Union side and on the Southern side as well during the Civil War. And Lincoln allowing them to have their own chaplain certainly helped facilitate that. Lincoln also admired, of course, the Old Testament and the Bible, and he admired Jewish theatrical productions. And this was something I just learned now when I was preparing for this. According to Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, she and Lincoln frequently invited Jewish friends to the White House. And on the very last day of his life, Mary Todd Lincoln insisted that Lincoln said he planned to visit Palestine after his second term in office ended. And to just kind of reflect the regard in which Lincoln was held by the Jewish community, after he was assassinated, some said Kaddish for him, several major congregations, and he's possibly the first non-Jew, at least in America, for whom Kaddish was said. So we have kind of a progression. There certainly were elements and stereotypes and some negative remarks from early Jewish presidents about Jews, but in general, it really is amazing to see how well Jews were accepted by people who were in the highest office as president or among the founding fathers. And that religious toleration that we appreciate even today was really set forward. I see in the chat from Donald Yale. Yes, certainly not every president, and even in FDR, as I said, who was so popular in the Jewish community, has been vilified a number of times for not making the rescue of Jews a priority during the war. And his excuse at the time was that he was trying to win the war. They would be sidetracked and not be able to win if they were working to try to bomb Auschwitz or other areas. But in general, and there certainly were blips, and there's certainly anti-Semitism that has raised its ugly head again today. But probably Jews welcomed here in the United States on a higher level than any other country in the world. So we're about right on time. I'd be happy to answer some questions and love to have people. I'm sure that Rebecca's happy to unmute you if you have some comments or stories that you would like to add as well.
Thank you so much.
Jeannie, I was wondering if you want to talk at all about Roosevelt and the relationship with the Jews?
Well, he certainly had Jews in his cabinet, and there were certainly numerous times. I would say Eleanor Roosevelt was probably a bigger advocate for Jewish freedom and for minority groups in general. But all the presidents are a product of their time. Roosevelt certainly came from a very elite family, and there were very strong pockets of anti-Semitism. Woodrow Wilson, as Danielle pointed out, was not a wonderful fan of Jews as well. So certainly up and down, but overall, I mean, I guess it's what your perspective is on Roosevelt altogether. I feel that he certainly could have done more, and he was certainly aware of what was going on at the time. And so, we see something similar now in the Ukraine, and how to balance the rescue mission for people who are in dire straits and still keep your eye on the ball for the overall foreign policy.
Right. Okay. Oh, do you have any background on Truman? Because my understanding was his wife was extremely anti-Semitic, and he never allowed his partner to come to the White House because of her.
I just read a book about Truman recently, and his friend Eddie Jacobson, his partner, did come to the White House. So I'm not sure that Jews were not allowed in. But, we're grateful. I think Jacobson had a significant influence on convincing Truman to support the state of Israel. And whether privately, we know we've seen in his letters what we would consider anti-Semitic remarks, et cetera. But the bottom line is that he helped make it happen.
Thank you.
Heard anything. I just want to say, in terms of Stratford-on-Avon, this hasn't got anything to do with this in particular, but while Adams was stationed in England as the American ambassador to Great Britain, and Jefferson was in France at the same time, ambassador to France, Jefferson came to London and took, I think it was about a 10-day trip with Adams. The two of them went together to visit a lot of the wonderful castles and the grand houses and the gardens. And they also visited Shakespeare's home. And this is mind-boggling for us today, but they went inside. There was a chair that was attributed to having been used by Shakespeare, and they each carved off a little piece of splinter to take home as a souvenir. So can you imagine doing that today in any historic site? Very kind of amusing, amazing.
Yeah. So we're going to move along. We have a few comments in the chat as well. Do you think FDR's blatant anti-Semitism affected his immigration policies during the Holocaust?
I think it may have, but I would say he was more affected by some of the people surrounding him that were very notably anti-Semitic, Secretary of State, etc. And I think that, they could have done much more, and they really just put up roadblocks one after another for immigration. It's depressing to look back and think about it, but it is pretty clear, if not Roosevelt himself, certainly those in many important positions in his administration were anti-Semitic, and that prevented them from things that they could have done to get more people out.
And then following up on that from Donald, we, during World War II, even Jews didn't support Jewish immigration, as they didn't want to bring attention to the Jews. And then he also commented that no Jews really were living in England during Shakespeare's time, which you also mentioned.
Yeah, a few, probably, if any. I mean, we can't count, but exactly. The Jewish community was divided, but that being said, there were certainly many groups who were very supportive, and there were a number of Orthodox Jewish institutions during World War II that raised funds and illegally bribed Germans to get Jews out of Germany and Poland.
Thank you. Prior to World War II, the United States population was very isolationist. FDR was more interested in getting elected and countering the isolationists' prior to Pearl Harbor. During the war, Morgenthau was more enamored of FDR that he didn't want to rattle his situation. Certainly Auschwitz could have been bombed, contrary to what was claimed about it being not a military priority.
Yeah, I mean, I think Morgenthau actually did make several attempts to bring Roosevelt on board, and it didn't work out. But I do know that Morgenthau facilitated meetings with certain Jewish leaders at the time, at the hope of convincing FDR to do more. It's very complicated, and it's not my area of expertise, but there have been dozens of books written on what could have been done. It's always, of course, hindsight is always 2020. But I really think that very strong thread of anti-Semitism running through the State Department was a very significant deterrent to moving Roosevelt towards helping the Jews more.
Yeah. And I have a question that might be very simple. When you had mentioned, Adams was well-versed and in Hebrew. So where did that education happen? I mean, were there scholars available to him? Where would he learn to read and write?
It was in the curriculum at Harvard. People getting classical educations, many of the schools, Princeton also required Hebrew, and some were Christian scholars, but there's a very famous one whose name escapes me. Oh, Judah Monis, I think, who was his name, at Harvard, who was recruited. He was a convert away from Judaism, even though people think now that he practiced his Judaism in private and did that to get ahead, but he was hired to teach at Harvard.
Thank you, because I thought I misheard you, and I thought it was a prerequisite to go to Harvard, but he actually.
Oh, no. They actually learned Hebrew in school, the way they learned Latin.
Right. Thank you. Little correction on dates: 1290, allowed back in the middle of the 17th
I didn't
century.
see the numbers, but yeah.
After Shakespeare. In 1656, Cromwell made a verbal promise backed by the Council of State to allow Jews to return to Britain and practice their faith freely. As a result, Jews from Holland, Spain, and Portugal came to Britain. They became more and more integrated into British society. Thank you for that.
And really, Holland and the Netherlands were one of the most tolerant for Jews. And that's really, I should say, in New York too. Remember, New York eventually became more tolerant, but it wasn't founded as a religious colony. It was founded as an economic colony, and that eventually made a difference.
I had read that during the time of the founding of the United States, the founding fathers were debating and considering what language to have as the language of the country. And Hebrew was among the languages that was seriously considered to be the language of the United States. That's one thing. And also to this day, I believe Yale or Harvard, or maybe both of them, have an Hebrew inscription in their
seal, their official seal,
in their manifesto, or in their, on their
seal, yeah,
on their seal, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Only that, there was a great reverence for the early Jews and what Adams said about bringing civilization. Where they parted ways was, of course, the beginning of Christianity. So even Adams respected Jews, had some friends, and certainly was an advocate, but it was his hope that eventually all Jews would convert to Christianity.
But did they consider Hebrew as one of the languages of the United States?
Oh, before you said that, I've never heard that.
Really?
It was quite a challenge for Americans to break away from England, and unbecoming British was a very hard thing to do. There were many things they revered about their English heritage, and it was kind of a fine line between how do you adapt and become a real full American, but still keep part of that heritage. Thank you for all for joining us. We're kind of thrilled with such a large crowd.